Welcome back to La Belle Vie and our law and crime content. Today I'm going to take a deeper dive on the battered spouse defense, which we understand Sarah Boone will be pursuing in her upcoming trial. Now, you may recall that Ms. Boone's attorney, Mr. Bankowitz, indicated to the court on January 17th that they would be pursuing this defense. He indicated that he had contacted a couple of experts but he hadn't retained one as of that date. One of those experts he had contacted was the expert that Mr. Padilla, Ms. Boone's prior lawyer, had retained. But he also indicated that in that prior engagement, it went nowhere. They didn't do any work. So that was that. So we know that then they're going to be pursuing this defense, but what we don't know is whether they've hired the expert yet, and also whether it would be Dr. Heller. So what I wanted to do today is dive a little deeper in the defense, and specifically from a different angle. Now, my first video on this goes over the battered spouse defense from the perspective of Florida law. And today I wanted to look at it a little deeper and look at it from the perspective of what a forensic psychologist or an expert would be looking at in this defense. So I thought it'd be easiest to go to Dr. Heller. So here he is. This is his main webpage. But then here he goes. So he provides expert testimony in family law, criminal law, and civil law actions. Okay, there we go. Okay, there's his website. He has been a psychologist since 1979, and he is an expert in forensic psychology. And let's go back to his prior website. There we go. Okay, this is his other website. And this is where I found a lot of really interesting information. So first here in his services sections, he goes into detail on how he provides expert services and testimony on the battered women's syndrome specifically. Now, he calls it battered women's syndrome because that's traditionally what it's been called in the psychology field, but it's really evolved from that. And so he kind of gives you a little bit of background on kind of where it started and how it's evolved through the years. And it's basically more broadly defined as intimate partner violence. And, it could be domestic or relationship abuse. They don't have to be married. It doesn't have to, it could be whatever. So it's just broader. But what has come out of the development in the area is this power and control wheel, which describes what occurs in an abusive relationship generally. And so that we'll go over in a little bit. But with respect to intimate partner violence, he uses the power and control wheel to address specific abuse characteristics of any relationship to illustrate how the perpetrator, the abuser, uses power, coercion, as well as physical and mental abuse to control the victim. So he talks then about his experience in the field. He has different certifications, but what he specifically does is he helps a judge or jury understand the syndrome itself, that it's not a clinical diagnosis, but it's really more of a syndrome. It's broader than just battered women, different cultural, social, and different symptoms of it, how it relates to post-traumatic stress disorder, how it can lead to the battered person committing another crime, or including potential violence. And in some, this is basically what it is in psychology, and kind of this power and control wheel is kind of at the heart of it as far as how to indicate behaviors that someone might be suffering from this syndrome. And they're all different ones here. And you don't have to have all of them. It's just as an example. But, some of them are not going to be surprising, like using intimidation, making the victim feel afraid by, mean looks and smashing things, using emotional abuse, putting people down, making people feel bad about themselves, calling the victim names, calling them crazy, using isolating the victim from their family and friends. That almost seems opposite, doesn't? Because I think for Sarah, she indicated she doesn't really have any family, and she certainly was in Brian's life a lot, and that her ex-husband. But George seemed to have the isolation. I think she'd indicated it was kind of one or the other. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. Making light of abuse, not taking it seriously, denying it happened, shifting responsibility. Using children, I don't think that's going to be here. Using male privilege and using economic abuse. So what he goes through then before is what I found interesting and really more pertinent for us, is how he can assist the court, the jury, and attorneys in a case that involves intimate partner violence. And here's where he goes through how he can actually help in this court setting. So first, he can provide the jury and the judge with both an understanding of general principles of domestic violence and also a framework within which to analyze the unique facts of the particular case being heard before the court. So the expert can kind of give, technical aspects of the syndrome and, basically translate it so that the jury can understand when they go back to the jury room with the evidence. Help a jury understand why the battered woman perceived herself to be in danger or why she believed it was immediately necessary to protect herself. So I guess in situations if it didn't seem reasonable for a person to act in that way. Help the jury understand that a battered woman's anger is normal. Help the jury understand why the battered woman fought back on this occasion but not others. Show the jury using research how the risk of serious or lethal violence against the victim often increases if the woman does leave the batter, and she's aware that it might get worse if she leaves. Educate the jury in order to facilitate recognition of physical and mental health effects of domestic violence, so kind of symptoms, combined with effects of culture and how that may have an effect on a battered woman's response to abuse. And then instruct a jury about the many psychological injuries that occur from intimate partner violence that are not readily apparent. Talks about here his qualifications. He's testified in over 100 trials. I bet it's higher than that at this point. He's on the staff at Rutgers, and he's assigned as a forensic psychologist at the State of New Jersey Correctional Facilities. Okay, very impressive. He's done CLEs. Here, he has provided consultation for attorneys in murder cases and other violent crimes that involve intimate partner violence and its effects on the defendant. That's exactly what this would be. He's done some CLE, continuing legal education. He's also had extensive experience working himself as a therapist with battered women in New York. And he started his career as a director of behavioral health services for the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, where he provided supervision of staff, direct services for victims, and training about intimate partner violence. So I'd say he's qualified. So it'll be interesting to see if they retain him. But what I also found super interesting is here, where he actually gives a case study of how he was able to educate a jury about intimate partner violence and help the jury understand exactly what contributed to killing her husband. Okay, so this was interesting. So this would give us a sense of how he would, how he would come in as the battered spouse defense expert in our trial. So here he gives an actual case. So this woman was arrested in November 2016 and charged with first-degree murder of her husband. Okay. After initially claiming the shooting was an accident. That sounds familiar. and later confessed to standing over her husband while he was asleep and shooting him in the head. Okay, so here we've got a situation where a defendant initially claimed that the shooting was an accident, but then she later confessed to basically shooting her husband in the head while he was asleep. So in our case, we've got a person that's, I would argue, is claiming this was an accident, right? It wasn't intentional. She just went up to bed. She didn't plan on going to sleep. So that sounds like accident to me. But then confesses, well, I don't know if we're going to get that here, but in any event, she confessed to standing over her husband while he was asleep and shooting him in the head. So in other words, this other defendant committed the act. It wasn't in like a situation where she was necessarily afraid. She wasn't being attacked. And so that's kind of similar to here where Sarah zips him in the suitcase. Remember, they were playing hide and seek and they were having a very good day, so it didn't seem like they were in the middle of a fight. So that's interesting, right? That's similar. The defendant told police that the stress of the relationship became too much for her, and that's why she shot her husband. Gosh, I could really see the defense using that here. They would, you'd say, oh, the stress of this, I guess, prior abuse, allegedly, just became too much all of a sudden, and that's why she definitely left him zipped in the bag, possibly did other things. I don't know. She was facing a mandatory sentence of life without parole if she was convicted of first-degree murder, and then she had 2 lesser offenses, one with 25 years and 10 years. Okay, so here we go. The defense team in this case that Dr. Heller testified in had found strong evidence of physical abuse that occurred many years in their marital relationship. So here I think the defense will be able to show that, right? And that's actually going to be my next video. Is I'm going to do a video that goes over George and Sarah's relationship with respect to domestic violence. And there's quite a bit there. And it's on both sides. But I want to go through that. And I also want to go over some of the interviews that have been made public that we've heard where both, frankly, individuals on both sides, so to speak, even George's brother indicated that he had seen bruises on Sarah, but bruises on George. So in any event, my next video is going to be on that. So that's something that the defense, like in this prior case, the defense in this case will be able to bring some of that stuff in, including, as this prior case, they had evidence of physical abuse plus evidence from former employees of the deceased husband that described his temper. It also appears that they had, in this prior case, there were holes in the wall. So there was some evidence, direct evidence of, the husband's temper. But the psychological injuries commonly observed in victims of intimate partner violence needed to be described to the jury. Incoming, Dr. Heller. So Dr. Heller testified about the psychological signs and symptoms that the average person who has never been exposed to these situations would not understand. And I think that's key. The expert is going to really need to be able to explain to the jury what is intimate partner violence and how that really applies here. Because I think the average person would not necessarily understand the actions in this case, in my opinion. So he explained to the jury that in psychological abuse, you don't have physical signs like a black eye or bruise. He testified that blaming, using male privilege, intimidation, isolation, as well as using children are all signs. He also talks about the power and control wheel, in addition to the 3 cycles of abuse, which very briefly is the first is kind of where first cycle is where you start seeing abuse occurring, just kind of bullying and tension building, and then it progresses to the second phase, which is kind of an adverse event, an arrest or some kind of beating or some kind of episode of abuse. And then that goes to the third phase called contrition, where the alleged abuser comes back and, says he's sorry or she's sorry and, kind of tries to make up for it. So in any event, that's part of what he testified to. He also told jurors that abuse victims often suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and numerous other psychological injuries that contribute to these victims not feeling safe even when they should. He also explained that sometimes after leaving or calling the police, the victim can be put in even more danger. And there's also a concept of learned helplessness, which makes it virtually impossible for the woman to leave, making her feel like she's in a state of siege. The myths and misconceptions of victims were also explained by Dr. Heller. He concluded that when an attack has physically ended, a victim of long-term abuse does not perceive the attack as being done as soon as it's over. So after 2 days of deliberations in June 2017, the jury found the defendant guilty of the lesser charge, actually the least charge, involuntary manslaughter. So basically, she got the least amount of jail time. So I'd say that was pretty successful. Very interesting. What do y'all think? Let me know in the comments below. I thought that's very interesting to see a real live case study of this expert and how he testified to intimate partner violence and the result. I thought that was very interesting. He ends his this portion of his website with what I thought was a cool example of what he can do for either side. So what he indicates here is, look, my expert testimony on intimate partner violence can differ depending on whether I'm testifying for the prosecution or whether I'm testifying for the defense. And so I thought this was interesting here because it shows you how he can help the one particular side. And so if you're an intimate partner violence case, when he says defense of women, but I think he means the defense of the battered spouse, he can describe all the factors of intimate partner violence as well as our power control wheel, explain how the process and effects of abuse can result in a victim of intimate partner violence assaulting or killing the perpetrator of intimate partner violence. I mean, that's the key, right? That's what the expert testimony is going to have to explain. And then, of course, it's up to the jury to decide, what they think. Describe the concept of duress and how it contributes to the victim participating in other crimes. Explain why battered women feel powerless to stop the perpetrator from harming or killing others. Explain why battered women may give false confessions, different descriptions of the abusive relationship, reconcile, and or recant what they previously said. I think we definitely have some of that here. Describe common misconceptions about intimate partner violence and the behavior of victims. And explain, compare, and contrast how the relationship between the defendant and her abuser are manifested in intimate partner violence. So a lot's there. I think, like I said, it'll be interesting to see who they do retain. But what do you guys think? He certainly seems qualified to me. And like I said, I really enjoyed the case study because I thought it was really helpful to see how an expert like this has testified in a prior case, kind of similar facts, and what the result was. So very interesting. As I mentioned, my next Sarah Boone content is going to be a overview of George and Sarah's domestic violence history, as well as other facts that we know thus far. So that will be coming soon. But in the meantime, thank you again for joining, and I hope to see you in my next video. Thanks so much.